I believe that the most damaging thoughts that a mom can have are those that she is not good enough. Those thoughts lead to mom guilt. And I believe those thoughts come more from not talking about how hard motherhood is and how hard motherhood can be.
Welcome to the Worthy Mother podcast, where we discuss all things identity, self-compassion, and fulfillment within and beyond motherhood. I'm Emily Rose Hardy, a mindset and self-love coach for moms. I am a firm believer that to be able to take care of our children, we must take care of ourselves first. This is not a parenting podcast. No, this is a podcast where we will challenge the societal expectations of what it means to be a mom, demystify the perfect mom myth, and learn to love ourselves. You are worthy, mama. Let's do this.
Hello. Welcome to the Worthy Mother podcast. It is just me today, and I am going to be addressing a trend that I have been seeing on social media, mostly in the sphere of mom influencers. And that trend is about how we need to stop talking about how hard motherhood is, because it really contributes to us then not enjoying the experience, feeling like our kids are burdens, all of that, right? I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on this growing conversation because really I have a lot to say. But before we get into it, I would like to shamelessly ask you to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts if you are enjoying this show week after week. We recently hit our 1-year mark of the Worthy Mother podcast, and I would just love your help getting the word out there of how valuable these conversations are so that other moms who find the show can know if it's something that they might benefit from tuning into also. Now, to get to the point of this episode, what exactly am I talking about in terms of this trend that I'm seeing? I'll just start by saying that, a lot of the content that I see on Instagram and TikTok is in the motherhood influencer space, motherhood support, just because of the work that I do and kind of what I'm consuming. And so this is something that I'm seeing through the algorithms that are showing up on my app. It may or may not be representative of the whole picture of the conversation, if this really is as widespread of a trend as I'm seeing, and if it's something that you also are seeing as well. I can't say for sure. But it is something that I personally am seeing over and over again. And it's a trend that really comes in all sorts of flavors. But essentially, these kind of posts and, reels and TikToks, they're saying that when we talk about how hard motherhood is or how hard it can be, that is what is actually causing us to be unhappy in motherhood. It's kind of like this idea that we don't have to subscribe to, quote, hot mess mom culture, right? But it's more about how we don't have to keep talking about how hard motherhood is. And there's posts even going as far as to blaming those kind of conversations about how hard motherhood is on them feeling unhappy in motherhood. And that when they release themselves from having those conversations or seeing content around how hard motherhood can be, they actually realized that it is a lot easier than they were thinking, right? That they were taking in, that actual repetitive nature of that message that it's hard is what was keeping them stuck in feeling like motherhood was hard. And when they kind of released that, it allowed them to feel like motherhood was easy. So I'm seeing these kind of posts again and again and again. And obviously, like on this platform, we're talking a lot about how hard motherhood can be. That's really a big part of my message. And so I really am like stopping to ask the question of, should we stop talking about how hard motherhood is? So I'm approaching this conversation as someone who really does talk quite a bit about the challenges of motherhood, and also as someone who has studied the context that contribute to these sorts of challenges in detail. I recently finished a certification as a motherhood studies practitioner. I've done a lot of work looking at the sociological components of motherhood, and I just have a background of really understanding this, not just as a mother, but as someone who's legitimately studied how mothers exist in the world and how that world contributes to their experiences, right? So, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts about this. So I'm going to start by saying that I think there's some absolute truth and validity in these messages, in the fact that our thoughts really do shape our feelings and our experiences, right? That is something that is a huge part of the work that I do. So it would be amiss for me not to acknowledge that, right? When we focus solely on the negative, allowing ourselves to have those negative thoughts over and over again, it does bring us down. Our thoughts really do shape our emotions. Like that is something that is key to understanding. Our thoughts shape our emotions, and those emotions then shape our perception of our experiences and how we react to the world around us. So, really, everything stems from the thoughts that we're having. So, yes, the thoughts that we are having are very important. It's important to consider what we're telling ourselves. So, if we say something is hard over and over again, it can absolutely end up that we will continue to feel like that thing is hard. Our minds are so powerful in that way. It's important to acknowledge that, like, the more we tell ourselves something's hard, the more it may continue to feel hard. To kind of explain this a little more, if someone is caught in a negative thought pattern about their experiences in motherhood, it does shape the way that they feel about their life experience, right? And it can shape the way that they then show up and act. So while we can think of this as thoughts like, my kids are such burdens, right? Like if you're having a thought, my kids are such burdens, which I think that's kind of the thoughts that these posts that I'm seeing are hinting at, then we really can end up feeling like we are weighed down by or burdened by our kids. And that can obviously impact how we show up, right? Undoubtedly. If we are thinking that our kids are burdens and then feeling burdened by them, we might show up a little bit differently than if we're, coming from a place of joy and gratitude. But honestly, I don't think that those kind of thoughts are the ones that moms are getting the most caught up in, right? Instead, I think it's those thoughts that they aren't doing a good enough job. They're comparing themselves to others and to some idealized version of a mother. And it's those thoughts that are leading to feelings of mom guilt, and that guilt and shame that we are not doing enough, we're doing it wrong, we're not good enough. Like that's the crux of the work that I do. Understanding those thoughts, where they're coming from, why they're so persistent in our culture, why so many moms deal with those types of thoughts, and the ripple effect of what happens when we have those kind of thoughts of guilt and shame over and over again. And then also like what we can do to free ourselves of this pattern of thinking. So we've had a lot of conversations about thoughts surrounding mom guilt on this podcast, right? Like our most recent episode, episode 57, was talking all about self-criticism and how those self-critical thoughts contribute to feelings of mom guilt. So it's something that I am super into understanding how our thoughts do impact us and how we can kind of retrain our brain to think different things. So that kind of brings me back to these posts and statements that being exposed to content that talks about how hard motherhood is are somehow damaging. Like it's perpetuating this thought pattern and keeping us stuck feeling like it's hard. And like I said, yes, when we see a lot of negativity about something over and over again, and we're thinking that, it can absolutely impact us in very, very real ways. But the thing is that I believe that the most damaging thoughts that a mom can have are those that she is not good enough. Those thoughts lead to mom guilt. And I believe those thoughts come more from not talking about how hard motherhood is and how hard motherhood can be. It's not from having those conversations that we end up in these negative thought patterns. It's really from the lack of conversations and the feeling like we are alone in our very challenging and difficult and oftentimes normal experiences. So I have seen these posts and really thought a lot about it and thought about this trend of we need to stop talking about how hard motherhood is. And I disagree. I think when we talk about how hard motherhood is and we can relate to one another and really connect about the things that are challenging, it can be actually really powerful. It can actually give us a lot of space to create new thought patterns that allow us to kind of step away from self-blame when it comes to how challenging things can be, right? And so that is really my perspective on it. That's really, in a sense, the whole goal of this podcast and my platform is to really get into understanding why things are so challenging, right? And I think it's really also important to note that like parenting, like the actual act of parenting is challenging. I think just kind of innately it is challenging. There's a lot of decisions we have to make. There are a lot of, tuning into our values and figuring out what actually is important to us when there might be two things that are important to us, but we have to decide what is more important. We have kids with feelings and their own ways of processing things that we have to tune into and deal with in a sense, right? Like it is not an easy job being a parent. It is very complex actually. And to kind of disregard that and say like we don't need to talk about how hard motherhood is, or like if we talk about how hard motherhood is, it's going to make it feel hard. It's like, well, it is hard. I don't really feel like there's any reason to sugarcoat that. And obviously, like there's thoughts we can have about empowering ourselves to be able to make decisions and not feel bogged down by the challenging aspects of parenting and making those decisions. But I also think that to say that that's not the reality is it's just not reflective of what it means to be a parent. Like it's challenging. It's hard. This is a really important job and our decisions impact our kids. And if that doesn't feel hard, I mean, I don't know if I believe that that's a really easy thing for anyone out there. So that alone, just looking at the fact that like raising children is complicated regardless of any outside influences, it's like it's okay to admit that being a parent is hard, right? But the thing is, then we add on these other elements of the context we live in that actually make living and existing as a mother challenging, right? Like that in itself is something we can kind of see as truth. Because when we are a mother, we are coming to that position with a whole societal history of what it means to be a mother. And whether we prescribe to those things or not, whether our mothers prescribe to those things or not, it is something that will undoubtedly impact our experiences, right? The expectations of others, the things that we expect of ourselves that we don't even realize come from these deeply ingrained cultural patterns. And a lot of our world just is not set up to support mothers. So going another layer, looking at the way our policies work and the workplace. When you are a mom, oftentimes you have to decide between staying home with your kids and letting go of a career that you may have worked really hard for, or going and working a job that's extremely demanding and that depletes you and makes it so that it's hard to exist as a mother and a professional, right? Like that saying, we're expected to work like we're not mothers and expected to mother like we don't have jobs, right? It's very challenging. And obviously, not every mother is going to be impacted in the same way. If there's a mom who maybe they're financially stable enough in the home for a mom to stay home and that's actually genuinely what she wants to do, yeah, that's not going to be a hard decision. But for many moms, that's not the case, right? They may have careers that they don't want to let go of, or maybe financially, both parents need to work and you have to make decisions about childcare. I mean, there's so many factors that go into just existing this one small element. I mean, it's a huge element, but it's this one small thing of how you're able to work and how you are able to function in a workplace as a mother. Like that alone is so challenging. And we see that reflected in all areas of our society and of our world. Like it's not set up for us to be able to exist in a way that is easy. And again, there are mothers who can, for the most part, avoid a lot of that because of their situation, right? But I think for the majority and for mothers as a whole, if we talk about kind of universally, like it's challenging. It is hard. There's no shame in saying that. And it also doesn't mean that like we have to not enjoy it. But I think just knowing that like when you're struggling because you are getting home from work at 5 o'clock in the evening and you're tired and you really want to be there and be present for your kids, but you're having a hard time, like that's not something to be ashamed of. That's not your fault. And yes, there may be decisions that can be made that will change that. But knowing that like those realities exist and accepting and acknowledging that it is hard is important because it doesn't do anyone any good to pretend that it's not. And so I also want to bring in the element of like why I find it so important to talk about this. Why is it important to talk about the things in motherhood that are hard? And really what it comes down to is the fact that oftentimes we feel shame about our experiences. We experience mom guilt because we feel like we should be doing something different. We're not doing something good enough. And oftentimes that comes from just kind of this spiral of silence and shame. Like we are telling ourselves something's hard, we're not doing a good job, because if I was doing a good job, it wouldn't be this hard. And then we don't express that, and it just kind of festers into the shame that is not doing anyone any good. And the antidote to that is to have the conversations. And whether you're a part of the conversation and you're expressing something that is hard for you, or you're listening to a conversation where other moms are expressing something that's hard for them that you can relate to and understand, okay, actually, that thing that I felt like was so shameful that it was hard is something that is fairly normal. And there's nothing really to be ashamed about. It can be really, really life changing. And gives us the permission to say, like, okay, yes, it's hard. And that does not reflect on who I am and my worth as a human. So I'll share something that has been kind of coming up in my own life that I think reflects this well. And that is about sleep. Sleep is something that for so many parents is a challenge, and for a lot of different reasons. I'll start just by saying that there are so many opinions about sleep out there and really how you should address sleep with your children. And a lot of people have opinions that they put onto others. I know that that's a big thing that I've seen online, is just, whether it's we should be co-sleeping with our kids, or like absolutely do not co-sleep with your kids, or it's really important that you allow your kids to feel safe at night and you go right to them when they're crying, or sharing that like that's not the reality for you and getting hate for it, whatever it is, right? And I know this is something that may be a hot topic issue for you, and so I'm not going to like get into it because that's not the point of the conversation, right? But it's just to say that there's a lot of opinions. And because there's a lot of opinions, there tends to be a lot of shame around talking about sleep with our kids. So in my circle, right, in the circle of moms that I've talked to recently, a lot of us have very different ways of addressing sleep in our own homes. And so this is a conversation I've had with so many moms with so many different perspectives. And I've really gotten to the conclusion, I think, that there would be a really funny movie about the secret life of parents at nighttime, because I think we all, to a degree, and that may be an overgeneralization. I know there's plenty of parents who they have the sleep routine down and sleep is not an issue in their home. But a lot of parents, that's not the case, right? It's like we are dealing with our kids not wanting to stay in their room, or if they're in our bed, they're kicking us, or trying to navigate, like, do I co-sleep? Do I not co-sleep? The kids aren't going to bed till 10, even though I put them down at 7. Like, what's going on here? How do I need to change the routine? On and on and on and on, right? And that's really there's so much of that happening in my household right now. And it's really hard. There's this additional layer to dealing with bedtime and sleep, in the fact that when your sleep is impacted, both for our kids and for ourselves, there's physiological impacts to that, right? It's really something that can impact a lot of areas of your life, like how you're able to show up at work, how you're able to process things, everything, your health. It's a really big deal to be getting sleep. And so when we're having challenges in our homes around sleep, it can be really hard. There's not only the shame, but there's also the actual, this is hard on my body and hard on me showing up in my life. So in my house right now, I have 2 boys. Currently, they are 2.5 and 5. And we have been transitioning them to sleep in their own room together. So just a little background on that, just to kind of lay it out, what the experience has been. Again, I think talking about these things is important. My oldest slept mostly in his crib in his own room, after he was a year old. And we had a pretty good routine. There was a lot of work to get there, but we had a pretty good routine. And then as soon as my youngest moved into the room, right, they share a bedroom, my oldest started sleeping with us, and he is a kicker. We ended up going from a queen size bed to a king size bed, hoping we'd get more space. And let me just tell you, I have not slept amazingly in a good year and a half since he's been really sleeping in our bed, unless there's a night where he's at grandma and grandpa's, right? And so it's been hard. It's something that personally, I don't really want him sleeping in my bed every night. But because it seemed harder to transition him back to the room with little brother, we just didn't do it. And so now little brother is out of his crib, and little brother did an amazing job sleeping in his crib. He loved being in his crib. You put him in his crib, he goes right to sleep, sleeps through the night most nights. He never would come into our room, which was very different than my first son, who would wake up and need reassurance, sometimes come snuggle with us, all of that. So things were going pretty easy there, and we didn't want to mess any of that up. But now that he's moved out of his crib and he doesn't know what to do out of a crib, that was his comfort zone. So he has started having a really hard time falling asleep, and he wakes up in the middle of the night. And we have had to do all kinds of things to get them to fall asleep together. It's become a whole ordeal to be able to get them to fall asleep in their room. And at midnight, right, they both end up in our bed anyway. And we're too tired to do anything about it, because at this point it's like, let's just get sleep. Could we walk them back to their room? Yeah, but we don't. We haven't been. And so we are living in this cycle that is not sustainable. This isn't going to work. I'm not going to be able to sustain this amount of sleep for very long. It is impacting me. I'm exhausted. And it's hard. It is so hard. And it's something that we have to navigate together as a family. And it's a different thing that we have to navigate than another family who has two different kids. Maybe they each have their own room. Maybe they set bedtime routines up differently to begin with, or maybe they're dealing with, a neurodivergent child who has a really hard time at night, and it's a very different experience than what we're having. But what I found is that so many of us have a hard time with this specific area, right? And whether it's something that we're actively working on, quote, fixing or not, it can be really hard. So to say that it's not hard, it just doesn't make sense, right? We're not trying to gaslight ourselves into feeling like, oh, I shouldn't feel like this is hard. It's not. Yeah, it is hard. It's been hard. And then there's the layer of like feeling ashamed, like why everyone has to go to bed. Every kid in the world goes to bed at night, right? Like, why am I having such a hard time with this? Other parents may not. And that's where this element of talking about it can be really powerful. I know for me, I've brought it up to people recently because I just want to have the conversation. I just want to say, like, how's bedtime going in your house? And maybe it's great, but a lot of times we realize like, oh no, someone else is having a hard time with it too. And it's a different problem they're dealing with than what I'm dealing with. But like, just knowing that I'm not alone in that makes a difference, right? It makes a difference to know that this hard is somewhat normal. And there may be things that I could do to make it easier. And there are supports that I could get. And there are routines that we could implement to make it easier. And I'm not saying that we want to just be stuck in this hard forever. But to be able to communicate and talk about that hard releases a lot of the possible shame that can come from those hard experiences, right? So that's just one example that I can give, but this is true in so many areas of our life. When we're dealing with the high emotional needs of our kids and we feel like we're dysregulated and having a hard time, responding to them, and then there's the shame that comes with shouting at our kid when it's like, I want to not shout at my kid. And we feel like we're this horrible parent. And then if we can talk about that and realize that, yes, there's reasons that might be happening, and we can work towards making it easier. We can work towards that healing in ourselves that needs to happen to get to a place where we can be more regulated, right? There can be the growth, there can be the progress, but in that we can also talk to others about how we're having a hard time and understand that like other people also may be having a hard time. And it validates the fact that being a parent is hard, being a mother is hard, existing as someone who is being held to standards out there that we may not have chose for ourselves, but that are out there and that we have very likely internalized and take in. It is hard. We don't need to gaslight ourselves into saying that this job should be easy, right? And so, yes, there are so many ways that we can practice gratitude for our roles as mothers, for our lives, for our children, for everything that we have. We can be so grateful for it. We can absolutely do things and focus on growth and focus on creating ease in our lives. Like, that is amazing. We deserve that. We deserve to be able to exist in a way that is comfortable for us. We deserve to be able to find ease. We deserve to not feel burdened by our roles and just the way that we might exist in the world. But we can talk about how hard it is. There is no shame in doing that. And it's also important to acknowledge that, like, talking about how hard motherhood is not just going to make you hate motherhood. Because very likely, if you are having a difficult time accepting the hard parts, right? Actually talking about it could release some of that shame that you may feel. And a lot of times that's more the underlying feeling that's holding us back and keeping us feeling down, right? It's that shame piece. It's that I'm not enough piece. So, kind of to conclude this, I don't think we should stop talking about how hard motherhood is and how hard motherhood can be. I actually think it's quite important that we continue to have these conversations because as individuals, there are things we can learn from normalizing the fact that it's challenging. And also, as people existing in this world, we can begin to break down those societal expectations. And if there's things that we can change to make it easier, amazing. And then there's some things that we may just have to accept because change happens slowly in a lot of ways. And just being able to talk about certain things that may contribute to challenges in motherhood and be able to acknowledge that that's a normal experience and that we don't have to blame ourselves for that, it can be really, really freeing. So this is one of those things. I would love to hear from you. Your thoughts on this. Do you think that we should stop talking about how hard motherhood is, or do you think there's quite a bit of value in having these conversations? If you want to share your thoughts, you can screenshot this episode and share it on your stories. Make sure to tag me at Honestly Emily Rose. We can have a conversation about really what the best way to navigate this space of content and conversation is when it comes to the challenges of motherhood. That is all for today. I so appreciate you being here and really value you showing up for yourself and normalizing these conversations so that you can live a life with more ease and compassion for yourself. I think that really is the key to bringing more enjoyment to our experiences as mothers. We'll end the conversation there, and I'll leave us with this. You are worthy, Mama.